Hello and welcome to this very special Link and Learn webinar today with our amazing all-female line of experts discussing breaking the bias in learning. So I'm your host, Janet Benson. I'm a senior researcher here in Learnovate, and I also spent many years in the world of learning and development. So I'm delighted to be part of this event today, and even more delighted to be joined today by some fantastic women with a huge amount of experience in the world of learning. And I'm sure you're all aware that we celebrated International Women's Day last month, and we also celebrated Women in History Month. But I think the main takeaway from that is that while it's important to focus on women in a certain month of the year, it's not merely for the month of March, but for all year round that we need to be focused on women, especially in the workplace. So I'm delighted to highlight that all our speakers today are members of Learnovate. And for those of you who are not familiar with Learnovate, we are global experts in the future of work and learning and in educational technology. We help organizations transform their learning experiences, and their users range from students to employees. You can find more information on Learnovate, our membership model, our growing list of amazing global members, and our research vision in the Learnovate research area to the left of your screen. You can also visit our website for more information on our organization and how you can join the Learnovate community. So back to today's Link and Learn. We will kick off with a presentation by Aoife Garvin of WorkJuggle, an Irish company providing services such as recruitment, consulting and training with a focus on flexible working. Aoife is going to talk us through the myths around learning and the underlying biases that exist beneath them, with guidance on learning in a post-pandemic world, which we all know is very relevant at the moment. We will then welcome Neha Budge from Orion Learning to the stage. Orion Learning are award-winning learning and development specialists. Neha will bring us through practical guidance on implementing unconscious bias training in your organization and showcasing e-learning that can be easily adapted. And now for the fun bit. So we're going to have a fun bit as well. We're going to ask everyone to jump into a one-to-one networking room for about 3 to 5 minutes to answer the following question. So have a think about this question for in the next few minutes, and think about how you might answer it when we get to the networking section. So the question is, who is the most inspiring woman you have encountered in your career and why? So have a think about that, and when we get to the networking, you can have a discussion with some other people around that topic. So to join in those networking sessions, you just have to click on the breakouts in the menu on the left of the screen, share your video and audio, and chat to your fellow attendees. And we would then love it if you shared your insights in the chat, and of course, let us know if any questions arise from your conversation. We want this to be very interactive. We want all our participants to be engaged in this webinar today. So please do add your comments, your questions, and everything into the chat. So then after the breakouts, we'll invite our panelists to join us on stage. We are honoured to have Sharon Claffey-Calliope of Learning Pool, who many of you will already know, a champion of women in the workplace. We have Christy Fliss from Zoom, whose job title is actually Head of Global Education and Head of Women at Zoom, which is really interesting. And I'm looking forward to talking to Christy about that a little bit more later on. And then last by no means least, we have Catherine Cullen of Digital Skillnet, who has vast experience in this area and is currently doing a huge amount of work around helping women get back into the workforce, and particularly into the tech workforce. So welcome to today's Link and Learn. And Aoife, we are delighted you could join us today.
And thanks everyone for having me.
Lovely to see you, Aoife. Are you ready to go with your presentation?
I am. Can I just check, Janet, that you can hear me and see me okay?
I can hear and see you perfectly.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to move to my next slide, and if you can let me know that that is coming up on the screen as well, that'd be great.
Yep, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you so much, Janet. And thank you, Louise, in the background for all your work as well. So as Janet mentioned, my name is Aoife Garvin, and I work with an organization called Work Juggle. So Work Juggle are dedicated to widening the talent pool and also critically thinking about the world of work. And what I mean when I say that is that we question the underlying assumptions that many of us have about the how and the where that we work today. And when we were founded 5 years ago, we were going out and we were talking to employers, learning institutions, HR managers, and candidates about flexible working, remote working, hybrid working, women returners, and contractors. And in such a short space of time, those what were only 5 years ago fringe topics, and in many ways quite unhip and unfashionable to be talking about, have now, due to the pandemic, become mainstream. And I'd also like to mention that we're very passionate about running a series of training programs because we like to help build inclusive organizations. And we run a lot of award-winning programs around topics like unconscious bias, female leadership programs, and women returner programs. We're fortunate to work with Technology Ireland Digital SkillNet in delivering some of those training programs. And these are aimed primarily at women in the workforce. And for those of you who aren't aware of some of what these programs are, I just want to give a little bit of background to you about them. So one of them is called Reboot, and the other is Tech Start. So with Technology Ireland, Digital SkillNet, and Work Juggle, we, as part of the Reboot program, we work with the women who, for whatever reason, primarily because of having had caring responsibilities, they have worked in IT, but they're now moving, but they've taken some time out of the workforce, be that a year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and they're now looking to come back into the workforce. And for any of you who may have been in that situation or who may even be in that situation now, it can be very daunting and intimidating. And you're trying to think, how do I go from here to getting back into gainful employment? And the Reboot program is a great program because we take about 20 women in a remote virtual setting, and for the course of a month we deliver professional skills, technical skills, aided by Dave Farrelly from Learnovate as well, and we also provide coaching. And then at the end of those 4 weeks, we're able then for the women to move into gainful employment, and they get terrific jobs in companies like Dell and Ulton Technologies, etc. So that's a great program to be a part of. And another program that's worth mentioning, because it will make it plays to a lot of our biases that we may have around learning and working, is Tech Start. And again, this is a women-only program, and it's for women who are currently working in a whole host of different industries, but they want to move into the world of tech. So they may be working in nursing, architecture, hospitality, and they want to transition into the world of tech. And Tech Start is a similar program to Reboot in that it's a 2-month program. We deliver professional skills, technical training, and job placement and coaching. And really, primarily, these training programs are wonderful facilitators for women to build their confidence and to come into the workforce, ideally guns blazing. So that's a little bit about who we are and the types of training programs that we deliver. It's also worth taking stock of where we've all been and where we've all come from. So we're all slowly emerging with different levels of blurriness around the eyes of we've emerged from the pandemic, fingers crossed. And I think we all know that that was a very challenging time for learners and learning institutions. I think for any of us who had to homeschool, we know that the struggle was real. We all had to grapple with Aladdin, virtual meetings, remote learning, and it was really, really difficult. And I think it had a really difficult toll on everyone's mental health. And it really highlighted how lonely we can feel when we're isolated and cut off from people. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the impact on the mental health later. But I think while we're here now in April 2022, I think it's a good time for us to take stock and say, yes, that was incredibly difficult, but what has come from it? What can we learn from what we've been through? And what can we take now as we hopefully embark from the post-pandemic world that we've been in? Before I do that, though, I want to talk a little bit about some of the myths that we have around learning, because myths are very powerful. They're defined as like a wildly held false belief or idea. And because of that, they're very powerful and they can really play to our unconscious biases. So I'd like to just talk briefly around some of the myths that we have around learning. So one of them would be education as a place. So I think it's fairly well ingrained in all of us that education could be this, this big institution, a physical place, potentially foreboding building, spiral towers, lofty seats of learning. And I think it's important to know, or I think we've all come to realize that really learning for the sake of learning isn't enough. And that sense of these lofty seats of learning can be very intimidating and exclusive to a lot of people. Also, academic excellence does not equate success in the workplace. And also we can see that the neurodiverse can often thrive outside of the kind of confines of a rigorous academic environment. Another myth that exists is around this idea that education must be full-time. So education is a 3 or 4 year degree. Fortunately, now we're finding that there's a lot more variety and options available to people. So we're seeing people take part in PLC courses, apprenticeships are on the rise, coding boot camps, etc. And I think it's really important as full-time education, like a typical degree or master's, becomes more expensive, that there's more options available to people. I did also personally find it quite interesting as I completed the census this year. I noticed a question on the census was, what age did you finish your education at? And I kind of think, in the spirit of lifelong learning and relearning and unlearning, that kind of closed cul-de-sac question is it's becoming kind of outdated. And I understand the narrative. I know why that question is there, because it does tell a story. So if I think of, say, my parents' generation, they will fill out that question and they'll say that they finished their full-time education when they were 14, 16, 18. And I know that in my generation, a lot more people will be able to say that they finished their full-time education when they were 21 or 22, because they were in a better position to be able to go to full-time education. So I get why the question is there, but I still think that kind of close-ended question, as we are all living longer, we're all retraining. For example, the women that I mentioned on the Tech Start program, they're moving from hospitality into the world of tech. The reality is that time will show that many of us will experience full-time education at many points throughout our working lives. And I think it'll be interesting to see how the census updates and changes to reflect how we learn and how we educate ourselves today. So another myth we have is that education finishes when you leave school. I think we are now all realizing the importance of continuous lifelong learning. There was a famous futurist and well-known American author called Alvin Toffler, who was very much ahead of his time. And he said that the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those that cannot read or write, but they will be those that cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And that it's really the people that have the mental adaptability, the flexibility to think, rethink, and unlearn and relearn that will be able to cope and manage through our working lives as everything changes and evolves all the time. There was also another famous author, there is a famous author called Adam Grant, who wrote a book called The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. And in it, he groups people, he groups people consciously or unconsciously. I'm not sure where his biases were on this one, but he calls them preachers, politicians, or scientists. And he says that really what we all need to be doing today is thinking and acting like a scientist, because it's the scientists that test, do experiments, query, they are paid to be curious, they have to wonder, is my theory on this correct? They're constantly changing and updating what they think. And they're the kind of skills that we need to be taking with us as on our kind of lifelong journey as such. Another myth we have around is training to be a something. So I went to school in the 90s and it was very much one might train to be a nurse or a teacher or an accountant. And there was a real kind of solidity in those traditional careers. But I think with the digital transformation, we've seen that idea of training at a young age to be something for the rest of your working career is not really relevant in today's world. And then the final myth, which is probably one of the most interesting ones and ones that I would have the most kind of personal experience with, is around this idea that it's an individual sport and it's just something that we do in isolation, studying at our desk for a degree, for example, when in reality, we're always all learning from each other. And I can really see the power of the group when I'm working with the women on our Tech Start program. And while I know the women learn from the trainers and from the content, they also hugely learn from each other. And there's real camaraderie and bonding that happens in the peer-to-peer learning. And it's wonderful to see this kind of confidence growing, and also network that's building and bonds that's growing between the women, and it helps them then to develop a kind of professional network as they then go into their working careers. So I think it's fair to say, as we now are in the post-pandemic world of learning, that a lot of what I mentioned there is a lot of it's become quite redundant. And we're now very much in the world of that fact that learning can take place anywhere. It can be in short, sharp bursts of learning. The power of the group is so strong, and we need to kind of teach how do we learn. So this on my slide there, you can see I have it's a little relic from my childhood, and it says things to know. So one of the things, for example, we've got, the highest mountain in the world. We've got the longest river in the world is the Missouri, Mississippi. So while it's great to learn these things, I do believe there is a role for rote learning. I'm fond of trying to get my children to get their heads around their multiplication tables so that they don't rely on their smartphones when they're 15. But I still think, that the world has changed so much, and that children and adults were not empty vessels, and we need to be constantly learning and unlearning and relearning and testing what we know and what we think we know, and having that kind of confidence, and not even just in ourselves, but that the workplaces and learning institutions are set up so that people have that feeling of psychological safety, that they are able to make mistakes and able to kind of unlearn and relearn. And that's a really important part of making all of that happen. So I'll just quickly talk now to exactly a bit about unconscious bias and what it is. So just to help set the scene. So I suppose it's irrational, it's snap judgments, it's being quick to think, reactive, and it's not very helpful, and it really can create a lot of in-groups and out-groups in the workplace. So when we deliver some of our training on unconscious bias, we do an exercise around circle of trust. And what this is, we ask people to choose 3 or 4 people that they would trust outside of, say, their immediate family, and they will write down the names of people in their lives whom they trust, and then we'll ask them to look at those people and ask what age are those people that they trust, what generation are they, what's their educational background, what's their ethnicity, and what's their religion, etc., etc. And often people will find that the people whom they trust are people who are very similar to themselves with respect to those kind of categories, and that would be an example of similarity bias. And so I know bias is there because it is a protective mechanism from an evolutionary perspective. We needed it a long, long time ago, but it doesn't really serve any purpose in today's modern workplace. Now, companies and learning institutions can take steps to counteract unconscious bias. And a lot of companies are, slowing down the decision-making process, thinking at the beginning, like, who are we hiring? Who are we recruiting? Questioning how we do things around here, checking in on ourselves and our own unconscious biases. So steps can be taken, and it's really important that happens. This, I suppose, just a little bit about why it is that we do those things. And I suppose it all comes back again to that kind of primal brain and the evolutionary mechanism behind it all. Our brain is a hungry monster, and it processes such a degree of information on a millisecond. It's really phenomenal. We're looking at like 11 million bits of information a second, which sounds almost kind of unbelievable, but I'm trusting the brain scientists on this one. And so then we have the unconscious mind, which is then processing around 40 to 50 pieces of information in a conscious way. And that means that our brain is exhausted. So for our brain to cope and for us to get through a day, be it a working day or a day of leisure, our brain is then putting things into patterns, and those patterns are helping us get through the day, but they're also bringing about unconscious biases. So here are some examples of unconscious bias. I won't talk to all of them. I'll just call out a couple so that are most relevant. So one would be, say, institutional bias. So that would go back to, say, the way companies might say, this is the way things are done around here. So, some companies have a kind of work hard, play hard culture. I know myself, I have experience in working on one where there was an expectation that I would travel to a different country, be it London or San Francisco, and I would take part in offsite team meetings that would take 3 to 4 days. And then after a day of meetings, we would then be expected to go out and party. And then there was no curfew. We could stay out for as long as we wanted, so long as we were there the next morning at our desks at 9 a.m. And while that's great in theory, the reality is, at the time I had a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, it's not really how I can use my time. But yet, if I'm not going out, if I'm not making those trips, if I'm not out in the pub, at the restaurants, making the bonds with my network and my colleagues, am I then in a place where I'm vulnerable to being passed over for a promotion, for example? I know as well that the MD of Goldman Sachs came out during the pandemic describing remote working as an aberration, wanting everyone back. And I think, that now is almost seems Neolithic in its thinking, because yes, we all need to come together. We're all here today on a lunch and learn. We all need to collaborate. But this idea that, everyone needs to be back in the office for a 9 to 5 presenteeism is outdated. Another bias that we have then would be around remote bias, which is obviously really relevant when we talk about learning remotely and working remotely. Now, a lot of the evidence and talk around it is very anecdotal at the moment, but Stanford did do a study where they looked at a travel agency and they found that those who were working remotely were working harder. They were logging more calls, but they were actually far less likely to get promoted, because those that were in the office and could be seen were the ones that were progressing. So there are a couple of examples around unconscious bias and how it plays out in the workplace, in learning institutions, and I suppose my own personal experience of it as well. So I suppose if we take what we know, all around our, the myths that we have around learning, everything we've learned during the pandemic, how can we take the best of the both worlds, the in-person and the virtual, the flexibility that we get with the virtual, and how can we create a collaborative learning environment? And I think this is a lovely quote here. It refers to collective effervescence. And it says here, the sense of energy and harmony that people feel when they come together in a group around a shared purpose. And I think it's that peer-to-peer learning and that group learning that is really so powerful in a virtual environment. And I'd like to finish my presentation today with a snapshot of one of the programs that I've mentioned to you, which is our Reboot program, which we run with Technology Ireland Digital SkillNet. And it's a really terrific program. We're running it at the moment. I'm on my lunch break as we speak. So you can see here a group of women coming together from all corners of the world, but all living in Ireland, but living in Ireland all over Ireland. And that's the great thing, I suppose, about the virtual setting, is that we have people from the wilds of West Clare taking part in this training program, whereas previously people could only have attended if they were based in Dublin or Cork, for example. So it's great to see all these women come together and know that the time that they've taken out of the workforce and any bias that they might have felt or loneliness that they might have felt in their learning is now being addressed in this kind of collaborative group environment. So that's everything from me, and I want to thank everyone for listening to me today.
Aoife, that was fantastic, and so much really good information there that I think we could listen to you for the rest of the event. But we'll get to you when we get to the panel, I suppose, and get you to answer some questions in relation to some of that really interesting information. But what I'll do for now is I'd like to invite Neha to the stage. Hi, Neha.
Hello.
Good to see you again. So Neha, when you're ready to start your presentation, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I don't have a presentation, so I'm just going to be chatting. So thanks, Aoife, for setting the scene about what unconscious bias is. And I love that phrase, collective effervescence. I'll be using that more often. So hi, everyone. I'm Neha Budge. I'm the Learning Transformation Manager at Orion Learning. Orion is an award-winning learning and development company. We're based in Belfast, although I work from home in Wicklow. We've been working with high-profile corporate and public sector organisations across Northern Ireland, Ireland and the UK, further afield for over 20 years. We're a major provider of learning to the HSE, to the Northern Ireland Civil Service, to Board BIA and to SEAI, amongst others. While we do a lot of different things in learning, what remains consistent is that we provide really effective learning design solutions. We deliver really tangible results for our learners, and our strapline is we create learning that works. So that's what we do. So my talk today is about implementing unconscious bias in your organization. So it's easier said than done, but really what I wanted to talk about is what we can do as L&D professionals to tackle unconscious bias, and what can we do so that we can lead change in our own organizations. So we know as L&D professionals that with any training initiative, it's more than just managers sending people off in a course. It should be more than the tick box exercise. More effective would be where learners can spot their own bias, they can do something to address that bias, and they can track themselves in that change, and maybe even the organization can track that change. So as with any training intervention, it works better when the entire system is set up for success. So we want to talk about strategies that we can do to offer to reduce bias. What can we do, for example, in the hiring process, in talent management, and in operations? How do we put together project teams, for example? Do we just put people that have a lot in common with each other and so on, because we think that's going to be effective? Can we look at that as a change? What can we do simply to just change interactions, encourage interactions with different people, so you can see personalities, you can see beyond stereotypes. We're in a unique position as L&D professionals. We're well placed to influence change within our own organizations. So here are my 5 steps for tackling unconscious bias. There's going to be a little download after the event as well, which Louise at Learnovate is going to be sending out. So I'll talk you through my 5 steps. So start by accepting that unconscious bias is a thing. It happens. It happens to everyone, and we're all human, and it's normal, but it's not okay. So my example is that a few years ago here at Orion, we did a great e-learning course for the HSE on intercultural awareness. So this was aimed at HSE staff who are working with patients from different cultural backgrounds. So as part of that e-learning course, there was a great quick fire sort of self-reflection exercise. A series of statements were presented on screen. You had to select whether you felt comfortable or uncomfortable with that statement, and you had to decide in 10 seconds. There's a bit of a timer on screen. So I looked at this module as part of my orientation when I first started here at Orion a couple of years ago, and I had to look at it just to get familiar with different types of content that we did. And it kind of took me back a bit. I thought I was a pretty liberal, pretty easygoing kind of person, but it turns out I have my own biases, and some of those biases are drawn from life experience. So that quick fire self-reflection exercise was a really good idea. I think it's something that you could integrate into online learning or into other types of learning. It was inspired by Harvard's implicit association test. I strongly encourage you to have a look at that online. You fill in some information about yourself. It modifies it based on your country as well. So, it'll give you Irish style questions, for example. There's a series of tests on different topics to examine your attitudes to race, gender, even weight. It's pretty eye-opening, actually. So I would suggest you have a look at that sometime. So once you've acknowledged that it is a thing, the next step is to acknowledge that you can do something to change that thing. So change is possible. So really start by showing your own willing to change, and you can be a leader in that and bring people along with you, maybe starting with your own team, starting with your areas of influence that are directly around you, project managers you might work with, other parts of the organization that you might have direct access to, and kind of start building from there. Find out what else is happening within your organization. So have you noticed certain things? Is unconscious bias coming out and say meetings with international clients, you go in with certain assumptions or things like that? Does it affect, for example, hiring of junior staff or interns and graduates, people that maybe aren't necessarily top of the list, but are very much part of your workforce? And once you've kind of done that, number 4 would be build opportunities for people from different backgrounds to get to know each other, to see beyond the bias, to see beyond stereotypes, and give in to the curiosity. Ask people about themselves, get to know them. And it's like what Aoife said, be the scientist that wants to know more, that's eternally curious. It's very much part of our makeup anyways, L&D professionals, to want to do that, to learn more about stuff and to learn more about people. And that's how we're going to break down barriers. And it's going to be some of that collective effervescence when we get those groups together. And finally, this is more than a tick box training exercise. It should be more than just sending people on an e-learning course or something and saying, yep, they're done. This should be integrated into policies, how you build those project teams, for example. A big part of what we do in terms of learning at Orion is about connecting back to the workplace through offline activities. So how can you bring learning back to colleagues? How can you influence that change within the organization? How can you bring that learning even to how you deal with customers, or indeed to the customers themselves? And even, little things like just job aids, just things that we can give learners so that this is kept at the forefront of their minds. And as with any learning intervention, I would suggest track the progress of it, evaluate the training initiatives, see what's working, see how people are changing, and see what changes that's leading to. And basically keep this on the agenda. This is more than just International Women's Day. This is a regular thing. So my top 5 takeaways are start by acknowledging that unconscious bias is a thing, that it happens, and it happens to all of us. Acknowledge that change is possible. Explore opportunities for change within your own organization. Get people talking to each other, and keep up the momentum. So that's it from me.
Neha, that was amazing. I was just like nodding like a nodding dog the whole time that you were speaking. And a few people actually in the chat would love a link to that tool that you mentioned. And I know you're going to share some insights and your 5 takeaways after this. So
I'll do
that would be
that.
great. A lot of
Thank
people
you.
really interested in that. So thank you so much, Neha. That was incredible. Again, could have listened to you all day as well. But what we're going to do is we're going to do a very short sort of networking session. We're going to cut it down to about 3 minutes because I think everyone wants to hear from these amazing panelists and we want to get to that as soon as possible. And it's so interesting what everyone's been speaking about so far. So for 3 minutes, we're just going to enter into those breakout sessions. You'll see, you should see it on the left-hand side of your screen. So for those 3 minutes, we would like you to discuss with whoever you're networking with, like who is the most inspiring woman you've encountered in your career and why. And if you want to share in the chat afterwards, some of those discussions that you've been having, that would be absolutely fantastic. So go ahead, have a look, check in the networking, and we'll be back here in 3 minutes. We're really excited to get to the panel now at this stage. So I hope everyone enjoyed that little piece of networking. I'm sorry it was quite short, but we're very keen to get to our panel discussion. So what I'm going to do is start to invite on stage our panel members. Neha.
Hello.
Hi, Neha. Aoife.
Hello.
Aoife. Sharon.
Hey, everyone.
Hey, Sharon. Christy.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Christy. Good to see
Hi,
you again.
Christy.
And Catherine.
Hello there.
Hello. So it's great to have you all here. So hopefully people will add some questions to the chat, but there are a few questions that we were kind of looking at discussing here with you guys. And I think an important one, I think one of the first one that we want to address is, could some of you guys give us a brief overview of your career in learning? And I want to kind of direct that initially at Christy, just based on your job title as head of women at Zoom. Could you tell us a little bit about your career, Christy?
Absolutely. So it's definitely not been linear in any sense of the word. My background and my studies in quote unquote traditional education sense, I loved the kickoff there with our biases in education. And I just came out of a in-person conference where these were very much apparent. But my studies were in psychology and interpersonal relations. And at that time, I was also one of the very first people on Facebook in the early days, and also running studies at the same time to see how we interacted and what that looked like when we interacted in person versus online versus perceptions of who someone was or how they, put themselves out there. So it was very part of my early career, which fast forward to being at what is now called LinkedIn Learning, but at the time was lynda.com. So was working with K through 12 schools across the US and helping to provide these skills. And at that time, and we still have this challenge here today, is that not everyone had the infrastructure. So we were always struggling with one, they don't have internet. So how are you actually going to access this content? But also we were really struggling with the synchronous element and being able to watch these videos and train and learn all at the same time, because there's such power in learning together. And I love that where it's not an individual sport. You're not just on your own. When we learn together, it's that much more powerful. So at the time, I heard about a little known company called Zoom, which everyone thought that I was crazy because why would you want to go into the oversaturated VC market? It's not exciting. It's not fun. It's okay. But the reason why I just really was taken by Eric's story, which he created Zoom, in order to be able to see his wife at university, who is a long distance away. And I love, he had this video where he's like, if I could just see her, if I could just give her a hug, I think that would be great. And it solved so many problems that I was having at the time, which was being able to play a video with audio at the same time and have everyone watch that together. And so I went and moved to Zoom. We were 40 employees, I believe, at the time. And didn't really realize what I was getting into in full, but just knew that we were out there helping solve problems. And that's what really we focused in on, is solving problems. And so then fast forward almost 7 years later, and here we are today, helping lead the way for global education across different countries, for higher education, for K through 12, for forever education, for your lifelong learning education, and also heading Women at Zoom. And so Women at Zoom is our first employee resource group at Zoom. It had tried to launch a couple different times, and I really, went and evaluated, okay, why wasn't this working? And one of the key pillars there was that we were focusing in on being able to show up as our authentic, true selves. And that was something that even in my own personal learning journey had to work on, because it was always have to present myself. I have to have it all together. And it's like, oh my goodness, we're all human. No one has it all together 24/7. That is impossible. But the power of being able to share and to be able to show up in the workplace and have moments of time in the workplace scheduled into the day where you could show up as your true authentic self and just be, whether that's happy, sad. I think we had sessions where, you know, it wasn't a true session unless somebody cried. And it was just giving that permission to be ourselves and to acknowledge that. And when we acknowledge the experiences that we're all having, the power that we have to, you know, really create positive change and really know that it's okay and we're okay. And so that's my bit of a ramble on the journey of how I got there. So I'll pause there and pass it back over to you.
That's amazing, Christy, especially your point about, Zoom, a little known company. And I think everyone's going, what? You know, what? And that was such a short time ago as well. It's amazing, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Amazing. So I'll throw it out to the panel, actually. Did anyone else want to talk through, I guess, their history in the world of learning?
I can go next. I have a pretty linear history, I think, so quite different to Christy in that I did a degree in computer engineering. I did some work experience straight after. Well, my first job after was not in anything related to e-learning, but I witnessed a lot of e-learning and I witnessed change that was happening within the organization. And I kind of said, you know what, I can do that. And I did a master's at the University of Manchester in basically master's in education. So I kind of got that under my belt and basically worked as an ID. So I worked mainly in healthcare for a number of years, and as a lead ID, and eventually as a project manager, as a senior project manager, and eventually at program management level for a large organization in the UK, basically the NHS's e-learning arm. And then I moved back to Ireland, and I started working for Orion, who provide very similar services to the HSE. So quite linear in that sense, I suppose.
Yeah, it's funny. I find with learning, I often find that people have started with something else and then gone into learning. I find that's a really common thing to happen. You know, for like myself, I studied like science and I was working in a lab for years, and then I realized it was the learning side of the organization that I liked. And I think that's quite common, that you start off with something and then you go, actually, it's the learning of something is the part that I really enjoy. So I want to get into that, you know, which I think is really interesting. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go on to the next question that we have, but we can come back and chat to some of the other panelists here about their kind of career, if that works later. But what I want to ask the panel, and I'm going to direct this one at you actually, Catherine, because I know you're doing a lot of work in this space at the moment, but the question is, how can we create a supportive space for women in the workplace, and particularly in the tech sector?
Yeah, and it's an area that, as Aoife referred to, we're just seeing a huge growth in it at the moment, definitely in the last 2 years. So Women Reboot and Women Tech Start are probably around since 2016 in various forms. But I think since the COVID has had a positive impact on refocusing women and opening maybe further opportunities for them to return to the workplace. And obviously within Technology Ireland Digital Skillnet, we receive funding from the National Training Fund and the Department of Higher Education via Skillnet Ireland to cascade out to organisations and our member companies to ensure that they have the programs and the skills and the talent that they need in order for them to be competitive in this vastly changing market and workplace. But the genesis of Reboot was companies, well, for starters, they don't have enough tech resources, and they were starting to tap into, we need to increase diversity, what is our hiring mechanism, and really revisit that and consciously check into their hiring strategies within the organization. And by May this year, we will have returned over almost 145 women back into the workplace, into roles. And that's, typically we would run 3 to 4 programs per year, whereas now we'll have 4 done in the first quarter. And that's the result of, I guess, a different shift in organizations' mentality in understanding something is wrong with our hiring policy. We need to figure that out, and let's use Digital Skillnet as a supportive pathway to try and identify these talents, because there is a preference for women to return to the workplace via our programs, and for the organizations to find that as well. And I think that's because the organizations that we're working with have a huge empathy to the situation the women are in. And these women are not, they're not going into entry-level roles. They're going into middle-level management. We can see them getting promoted on LinkedIn, and their careers are just blossoming once they get back in. And we're finding that gap in the CV is still a major barrier to entry. Potentially there's an assumption within organizations that they've forgotten what their degrees were about. They've forgotten their 10 years work experience, and that is not the case. And I think my advice to organizations is to, like, I struggle going back to work after a 2-week holiday. So all I needed was a little bit of time just to refigure out my passwords, to learn the systems and the jargon again. And that's all these women need to understand, be supportive, over communicate. We have a 6-month probationary period for anyone going into the workplace. So there's no reason why we should have that. And I would also say that, the war on talent is critical, at a critical state out there. And you would find that we have returners that are available, like we're absolutely oversubscribed for programs, and we'll potentially run 3 more before the end of the year, supporting over 60 companies. That's major. And it's a major investment in the companies that we want this talent. We're seeing a real shift in their mindset, in that they're looking to hire for potential. They're not looking for core, relevant, up-to-date tech skills. They want potential. They want to see the attitude and the cultural fit for that organization. And I think they're finding some wonderful talent. It means that it's a very safe environment for people to flourish in as well, because everyone's on the same page.
That's amazing, Catherine. Those numbers are even just amazing. And I know we've talked about this before. I think these women definitely should be focusing on the positives and all the amazing things they've learned, even during that gap. Instead of, I think, often I think that women are, when we could talk about imposter syndrome, I know all of us could talk about that all day long as well. But I think sometimes the women are kind of like, they're apologizing for the gap before they start to talk about, here's all my strengths and why I'd be amazing for your organization, all that kind of stuff. As women, I think we need to be focusing on all our amazing strengths and all our positives.
Right. And I just want to add, we need to start rewarding women who have the courage and the boldness to do that. And credit to Catherine's company that they are looking at that. There's so many statistics that we're saying women are self-selecting out. Oh no, they're there. They're bold. We need to reward and start hiring women as we do men on potential and not on experience alone. So I think that's the key thing. And as women leaders in companies, if you're out there and you're in leadership, go to the HR, make sure they're hiring and they're getting that wealth of diversity in regard to hiring people that might not fit the typical standard, list of bullets there, including women with a career break, which is phenomenal. They're different perspectives. And Catherine, I love that story.
And we, in the training, actually, we do an exercise on that, the gap. We call it owning the gap. And we ask the women to think back on their time off and all the different skills that they've learned and all the different experiences that they've had, and then see which of those so many of them are transferable. And it's actually a really heartwarming exercise, because the women, we talk about it, and then they go off and they do some self-reflection, and then they come back. And for some women, they just completely rethink about their time off. They think that they were at home emptying the dishwasher and wiping sick up, and then they just completely reframe it in their head, and they realize that they've so much to bring to the company, and the companies are just incredibly lucky to have them.
Absolutely. And that level of maturity, and I don't necessarily like the word maturity, but those women are bringing that to teams and their experiences and stuff like that. I think it's absolutely amazing. Sharon, I think I might jump to you next, because I know you've done some research in this area. And the question is around, how do you think the industry has progressed in terms of supporting women and minorities?
Sadly, no, they have not. The She Session provides great numbers. Now, the She Session is the 865,000 women that have left the workforce. And this is from a report that I'll be sending out when they do the follow-up, with 200 versus 216,000 men. So that's a great difference. And also during that same time period, 16% of men were received promotions. And I know people that actually had this. I'm sure many of you have stories where most women weren't leaving because they were loaded and they just want to sit back and eat bonbons. They're doing it because they're juggling. Unfortunately, ethnic minority women typically are the breadwinners, and they're typically the most impacted by what we just had happen the past couple of years. They're juggling homeschooling, getting to work. There's some great notes, though. I don't want to leave it on a negative note because there's a lot we can do. A lot of what you just heard from Aoife and Catherine are very valuable. And I think Neha, actually, you shared that there's the opportunity to provide key areas for people to go into. That was your number 4. And then go beyond the policies. And we had a whole note here on a Women in Learning, is that go beyond using labels and distractors. These policies are no good if they're not being acted upon. So don't use the excuse that globally we have different labels for ethnic minorities. So at one point it was asked of me, well, just don't bring it up. Are you kidding? It's 3/4 of where the conversation stood. Enough with statistics. I laid those out there just to say, if you feel it as a woman in business that it feels a little uneven, you're spot on. But we need to walk the talk. We need to address the distinct challenges head on, foster a culture that supports values, ethnic women. We can't just say or talk around it and then not put women in place of leadership. Managers play a critical role, but many are lost as to what to do. So much of what we've heard earlier is we need to supply people in learning and development these toolkits. We're working on empowering women leaders with a great big brand company here. And that's something we want to make available to all women, all affinity groups. And then this is sketchy and scary, but we need to address racial violence, news, and things at work. I actually know a really amazing 30 under 30 woman that left her organization in the learning and development role because it wasn't being addressed, and she felt fearful. And then the most important thing that we need to do to address this is, if you don't know what's missing, please ask. There's so many ways that you'll find information, and the unconscious biases will come out. But once you ask, you'll see at least where you should be headed. So I did want to make sure we throw that in there because it's critically important that we tackle this and we don't let it slide by. You're not imagining it, and we need to start rewarding women who have the bold courage. I think the Gen Zs coming into the workforce, holy cow, those millennials, they opened it, and the Gen Zs are plowing through. They talk about the fact that they won't work anywhere. Zoom comes up really high on your values and ethics. I have 2 young Gen Zs, and they are leaving the business if it doesn't have the values and the ethics, and they want to see women in leadership roles. So
amazing.
I get a little crazy with it, but
no, actually, Sharon, following on from that, we've had a nice question from Kevin, actually, one of our participants, around what your opinions are around the most important next steps or policies that society or corporations need to implement to ensure equity in the workplace moving forward. And I'll throw that out to the panel in general.
Could I just, we just did a gender equality and cybersecurity and compliance the day after St. Paddy's. And there was a gentleman from Bank of Ireland out of the New York office. I think he's from California over. And he said, this was amazing, that they will not start the interview process until they have equal number of women and men. So if you had 7 men applying and only 3 women, they would level the playing field by having the top 3 and the 3 women. So it's not about hiring a woman, it's hiring the best person, but they're giving equal and fair rights to balance that out. And I just thought that was absolutely fabulous. So I just wanted to share that as something. Fantastic. And one other positive note, in the world of cybersecurity, in 2018, there were only 11% of women. In 2022, 24%. So the needle is moving. It's really neat to look at sectors that are doing it well.
Yeah, absolutely. And learn from each other, Sharon. Did anyone else want to add to that question that Kevin posed? Because we have so many questions. We could do an entire other session on this, which I'd absolutely love to do. But in the interest of time, I suppose, what as a kind of a final question to throw out to the panel, because I think it's a really nice one, can we wrap it up with, the best advice that you've received in your career? What advice would you give to a woman embarking on a career in learning in particular?
I can start that, Janet.
Yeah, brilliant, Catherine. Yeah.
Yeah, so embarking a career in learning, I think, and having someone who has had a non-linear journey into the learning industry as well, I've never done anything that is as meaningful as working in learning. You know, within Digital SkillNet, we have the opportunity to fill niches in the learning market, and I think we're have a naturally, when you're in learning, you have a chance to naturally start countering that unconscious bias. So whether it's through the design and the development of programs, whether it's through your various interactions with organizations, and whether it's with your peers and your natural conversations as well. And I also think that to encourage people to get into learning, and even to feed when you're in an organization and you're seeing the learning modules and pathways that are coming down the track, you know, in this generation, we have an opportunity to create and undertake opportunities which we weren't offered. You know, so go back into the 90s when I was in college, I just took the first course that I got in the CAO form because I was looking for the crack. And then when I got into and I was naturally more influenced. I should have got into engineering, or I should have gone into something different. But it was all the boys that were doing that type of thing. Boys were all doing technical drawing in school. So I think we have an opportunity to challenge all those social norms and create opportunities through our learning environment and our learning, I guess, platform to create sustainable and sustainable learning towards breaking that bias.
Yeah, absolutely.
Janet, can I just say, I'm seeing a couple of comments over here, and if you're imagining that women don't support women, sadly, the biggest encounter that we've had. So for the men that are out there, thank you, because most women in the panels I've interviewed have said men have helped them along. The only time they've had issues is through other women. So we've got to change that up. And then the one thing that someone told me, and she wasn't my manager for long, she was amazing. She said, if you want to start going to conferences, and I highly recommend, if you can get to the conferences virtual like this or in person, please do it. That's really the network that carries you through. She goes, start asking to present at them. So I'm putting an offer out to everyone out there, men and women, that at Learning Technologies, and I'm sure I'm going to be partnering with Learnovate there, and we're going to be together. I'm going to be leading the Women in Learning session, lunchtime session on May 4th. If you want to be highlighted on that, reach out to me and we'll make sure that happens, because it needs to start now. And it needs, as you wrap up this thing, if you could just text or email or get in touch with one woman, something encouraging, could be your mother, sister, someone you work with, someone you report to. That's where it needs to start. It needs to start today.
That's fantastic, Sharon. Love that. I'll give us, I suppose, open it up to, does anyone want to add anything to that? Because I think that's such an important point what you just made there, Sharon. That's amazing. No, and if not, I'm happy to wrap up. I'm actually going to wrap up with a couple of resources, and one is kind of linked to what you just mentioned there, Sharon. One of the really good resources that I think, you know, for women in particular, is that Women in Learning LinkedIn group. So # Women in Learning. I think if you want to go and have a look at that, there's some really amazing stuff in there. Also, to note, our next Inside Learning podcast from Learnovate was going to be with Annie Auerbach, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who's the author of Flex, Reinventing Work for a Smarter, Happier Life. And she also has a Flex podcast, and it's about the sort of the modern women's handbook. So again, really good resource that we could take a look at if people are interested. Again, in order to close out the event, I just want to let everyone know who's attended that we will be sharing some of these amazing resources that people have mentioned during their talks. I absolutely loved this event, I have to say. It was amazing to be part of it and to be working and chatting to these amazing women. I'm absolutely delighted, and I would love to do another one where we look at, again, you know, we had so many questions we could have talked to you guys about. I honestly think we could do a whole other webinar on just those questions again. So we look to do that maybe in the future. I'll talk to Louise about that. But just to say thank you to all of you guys, all the panel members, the amazing presentations, and thank you to everyone who attended. And again, you know, do get in touch, do have a look at Learnovate, do, you know, get in touch with us if there's anything you're interested in, and do have a listen to some of those podcasts. There's some amazing stuff out there. So thank you so much. I'll wrap up now just a little bit early so people can get back into the work mode and get back into work. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
See you all soon.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.